The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Catherine stood by the tall window, her fingers tracing patterns on the cold glass. The news had arrived 3 days ago, delivered by a man in a dark suit who spoke in hushed official tones. William would be leaving for a mission that could not be delayed, could not be refused, and most painfully, could not be discussed. She had always known this day might come. When she married into the royal family, she understood that duty would sometimes demand sacrifices that ordinary couples never faced. But understanding something in theory and living it in reality were two completely different things. The weight of royal responsibility had never felt heavier than it did in this moment. William moved quietly through their private quarters, his movements careful and deliberate. He packed with the precision of someone who had done this before, folding each item with military efficiency. Yet Catherine noticed the way his hands lingered on the small framed photo of their children, the slight tremor in his fingers as he placed it carefully in his travel bag. The children had been told that their father was going away on important work for the crown. George, being the eldest, seemed to sense there was more to the story than they were being told. His questions had grown more persistent over the past few days, his young mind trying to piece together why the atmosphere in their home had become so heavy with unspoken words. Charlotte had taken to following her mother around the palace, her small hand constantly seeking Catherine's for reassurance. Even little Louis seemed affected by the tension, becoming more clingy and requiring extra bedtime stories. The family that had always been their source of strength was about to be torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Palace staff moved through the halls with unusual quietness, their usual chatter replaced by respectful silence. Everyone knew something significant was happening. Though the details remained locked away in meetings Catherine was not permitted to attend. The isolation of not knowing the full truth made everything worse, leaving her imagination to fill in the terrifying blanks. As evening approached, Catherine found herself standing in the garden where she and William had shared so many peaceful moments. The roses they had planted together were beginning to bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the darkness she felt inside. She remembered their wedding day, how they had promised to face whatever challenges came their way together. Now, for the first time, they would have to face the unknown apart. William joined her in the garden as the sun began to set, his presence both comforting and heartbreaking. They stood side by side, not touching, both lost in their own thoughts about what the coming separation would mean. The silence between them was filled with all the words they could not say, all the fears they could not voice, and all the love they would have to carry in their hearts while apart. The palace bells chimed 8 o'clock, their sound echoing across the grounds like a countdown to goodbye. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to memorize this moment, the sound of William's breathing beside her, the scent of the evening air, the feeling of being complete that would soon be just a memory. Tomorrow everything would change, and there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. The breakfast table sat mostly untouched, elaborate dishes growing cold while the family went through the motions of normalcy. William sat across from Catherine, their usual easy conversation replaced by careful politeness. Even the children seemed to sense that something was different about this morning, eating quietly instead of their usual cheerful chatter. George kept glancing between his parents, his young mind clearly working to understand why everyone seemed so serious. Charlotte had barely touched her favorite breakfast, instead focusing all her attention on arranging her toys in perfect lines beside her plate. Louis babbled contentedly in his high chair, blissfully unaware that this was the last morning they would all share together for an unknown amount of time. Catherine watched William interact with each child, noting how he seemed to be memorizing their faces, their voices, their small mannerisms. When Charlotte showed him her drawing of their family, his smile was bright, but his eyes held a sadness that made Catherine's chest tighten. He praised George's homework with extra enthusiasm, ruffled Louis's hair with tender care, and answered their innocent questions with patience that spoke of someone trying to give them enough love to. Last, the palace staff began, arriving with official documents that required William's attention before his departure. Catherine watched him sign papers with practiced ease, his public persona sliding into place even at their breakfast table. But she caught the moments when the mask slipped, the way his pen hesitated over certain signatures, the deep breath he took before each official stamp, the glance he stole at their family portrait hanging on the wall. After breakfast, William disappeared into his study for final briefings that Catherine was not allowed to attend. She found herself wandering the halls aimlessly, unable to settle into any normal routine. The palace felt different already, as if the very walls knew that change was coming. Staff members offered sympathetic smiles but kept their distance, understanding that some grief needed space to breathe. The afternoon brought a flurry of last-minute preparations. William's personal aide arrived with travel arrangements and security details, speaking in the coded language that royal protection always used. Catherine caught fragments of conversations about departure times and transportation, each detail another step closer to goodbye. She found herself memorizing these ordinary moments, knowing they would become precious memories in the days to come. As the children played in the nursery, Catherine and William finally found themselves alone in their sitting room. The conversation they both needed to have hung between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. William reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the familiar gesture that had comforted them through countless challenges. But this time even his touch couldn't chase away the fear that was growing stronger with each passing hour. They talked about practical things, how often they might be able to communicate, what to tell the children if they asked difficult questions, how to maintain routines that would keep everyone grounded. But beneath these necessary discussions lay all the things they couldn't say, all the fears they couldn't voice, all the love that would have to sustain them through whatever was coming. Evening approached too quickly, bringing with it the knowledge that their time together was running out. The children's bedtime routine became especially important. Each story read with extra care, each goodnight kiss lingering longer than usual. William tucked each child into bed personally, his voice steady as he promised to return soon, though Catherine could see the effort it took to keep that promise light and confident. As night fell over the palace, Catherine and William faced their final hours together, both knowing that when morning came, everything would be different. The weight of unspoken goodbyes pressed down on them as they tried to find peace in each other's presence, knowing that tomorrow would test their love in ways they had never imagined possible. The clock on their bedside table seemed to tick louder than usual as Catherine lay awake, listening to William's breathing beside her. Sleep had become impossible, each passing minute bringing them closer to a dawn neither wanted to face. She turned carefully to study his profile in the moonlight, trying to memorize every detail of his face, every line that had deepened since their wedding day, every feature that made him uniquely hers. William wasn't sleeping either, though he lay still, lost in his own thoughts about the mission ahead. The briefings had been more serious than he had let Catherine know, the risks greater than he could share. He thought about their children sleeping peacefully down the hall, unaware that their father might not return from this assignment. The weight of that possibility pressed against his chest like a stone. They had been through separations before, but nothing like this. Previous royal duties had taken him away for days or weeks with regular communication and known return dates. This departure felt different, shrouded in secrecy and uncertainty that made planning impossible. The official channels had been clear. Contact would be limited, duration unknown, outcome uncertain. As the first light of dawn crept through their curtains, Catherine felt William's hand find hers under the covers. They lay there connected by touch, sharing a silence that held more meaning than any words could express. Both knew that once they got up, once they began the motions of this final day, there would be no stopping the machinery that would take him away from everything he loved. The morning routine began earlier than usual, with staff arriving to handle final preparations for William's departure. Catherine helped him dress, her fingers fastening buttons and adjusting his uniform with the same care she had shown on their wedding day. Each small gesture felt significant, weighted with the knowledge that it might be months before she could perform these simple acts of love again. Breakfast was a quiet affair, with the children sensing the solemnity of the adults around them. George asked why everyone seemed so serious, and William knelt down to his son's level, explaining that sometimes grown-ups had to do important work that took them away from the people they loved. Charlotte climbed onto Catherine's lap, seeking comfort from the tension she could feel but couldn't understand. The palace corridors filled with officials and security personnel as departure time approached. Catherine watched from their window as cars arranged themselves in the courtyard, their dark windows and serious drivers, a reminder of the dangerous world that existed beyond their protected walls. This wasn't a public departure with Ceremonies and photographs, this was something that would happen in shadows and silence. William's final briefing took place in the secure room where Catherine had never been allowed to enter. She waited outside, her hands clasped tightly together, watching serious men in dark suits come and go with files and urgent whispers. Whatever was in those documents, whatever mission required such secrecy, she knew it was more dangerous than anything William had faced before. When the briefing ended, William emerged looking more composed but somehow more distant, as if he had already begun the mental transformation that would help him survive whatever lay ahead. Catherine saw the exact moment when her husband became a royal operative, his personal feelings locked away behind the professional demeanor that duty demanded. The children were brought to say goodbye, their innocent hugs and kisses a painful contrast to the gravity of the situation. William held each child longer than usual, whispering private words that made George stand a little straighter and brought tears to Charlotte's eyes. Louis giggled and played with his father's uniform buttons, unaware that this game would have to last in memory for an unknown length of time. Palace staff lined the hallways as William made his final walk through their home, each person offering respectful nods that acknowledged both his departure and their hopes for his safe return. Catherine walked beside him, her hand in his, trying to make these last steps together count for all the steps they wouldn't be able to take side by side. The courtyard waited with its assembled cars and serious faces, the machinery of royal duty ready to carry William away from everything that mattered most to him. Catherine felt the finality approaching like a wave she couldn't stop, knowing that in minutes, maybe seconds, their life together would be reduced to memories and hope for reunion. The courtyard felt like a stage set for tragedy as Catherine and William stepped outside together for the last time. The morning air was crisp and clear, birds singing in the trees as if this were any ordinary day. But everything else spoke of finality, the waiting cars with their engines running, the security teams positioned at careful intervals, the officials checking their watches with practiced efficiency. Catherine's throat felt tight as they approached the lead vehicle. This was the moment she had been dreading since the news first arrived. The moment when theory became reality, and their separation stopped being something that would happen and became something that was happening now. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clasped them together to hide her fear from the watching officials. William turned to face her, and for a moment, the professional mask fell away completely. In his eyes, she saw everything he couldn't say. His love for her, his fear about what lay ahead, his desperate wish that duty didn't demand this sacrifice. They stood facing each other while the world waited, two people whose private goodbye had to happen under the watchful eyes of strangers. The children watched from an upstairs window, their faces pressed against the glass. George held Charlotte's hand while their nanny held Louis, all of them trying to understand why this departure felt different from all the others. Catherine could feel their eyes on her and knew she had to be strong for them, had to show them how to be brave even when your heart was breaking. William reached out and touched her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The gesture was so tender, so intimate despite their public setting, that it nearly broke her composure entirely. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for just a moment to memorize the feeling of his hand against her skin. No words passed between them in those final seconds. What could be said that hadn't already been expressed in their years together, in their shared glances over breakfast, in the way they had held each other through the long night? Their love existed beyond words, in the space between heartbeats, in the way they breathed in rhythm even when they weren't touching. The car door opened with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the silence. William's security detail stepped forward respectfully, their presence a reminder that duty was calling and could not be delayed any longer. He had to go now while he still could, while his resolve held firm against the pull of staying with everything he loved. William stepped back from Catherine, his hand falling away from her face slowly, reluctantly. She watched him transform before her eyes into the composed royal operative who could handle whatever mission awaited him. But just before he turned toward the car, he looked back at her with an expression so full of love and longing that it stopped her breath entirely. He walked to the car with measured steps, each one taking him further from her and closer to the unknown. Catherine stood perfectly still, her royal training keeping her upright when everything inside her wanted to collapse. She had been taught to bear witness to duty with grace, to smile when the cameras were watching, to wave when the crowds expected it. But there were no cameras here, no crowds to please. Just a woman watching the man she loved walk away. The car door closed with finality, and Catherine felt something inside her chest crack like ice under pressure. Through the tinted windows, she could see William's silhouette, but she could no longer see his face, could no longer read his expressions or share his thoughts. He had become unreachable even though he was still only meters away from her. The convoy began to move slowly, wheels crunching on gravel as the cars arranged themselves for departure. Catherine raised her hand in a small wave, hoping William could see her through the dark glass, hoping he knew that she would be thinking of him every moment until he returned. The lead car paused briefly at the palace gates, and she imagined him looking back one last time before disappearing into the world beyond their protected walls. The sound of the engines faded gradually, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any noise could have been. Catherine stood alone in the empty courtyard, surrounded by the lingering traces of his presence, tire marks in the gravel, the faint scent of his cologne in the air, the memory of his last touch still warm on her cheek. The goodbye was over, but the waiting had just begun. The palace felt impossibly quiet after the convoy disappeared from sight. Catherine remained in the courtyard for several minutes as if staying in the place where she had last seen William could somehow keep him closer. The morning sun climbed higher, casting new shadows across the gravel where his car had been. But she couldn't bring herself to move, couldn't bear to take the first step back into a life without him. Palace staff appeared and disappeared around her with respectful distance, understanding that she needed these moments to absorb what had just happened. The children's voices drifted down from the upstairs window where they still waited, their questions floating on the morning air like birds she couldn't catch. Soon she would have to go to them, would have to explain what couldn't be explained, would have to be their anchor while her own world felt unmoored. When Catherine finally turned to go back inside, each step felt like walking through water. The familiar halls looked different somehow, as if William's absence had changed the very architecture of their home. Portraits of past royals watched from their frames with knowing eyes, all of them having faced their own separations, their own sacrifices for crown and country. But their understanding offered little comfort to a woman whose husband had just walked into danger. George met her at the top of the stairs, his young face serious with questions he was old enough to ask but too young to understand the answers to. Charlotte appeared beside him, her favorite stuffed animal clutched tightly against her chest, seeking comfort from whatever could provide it. Louis toddled over on unsteady legs, reaching up to be held, blissfully unaware that the man who usually swept him into strong arms was gone. Catherine gathered her children around her in the nursery, sitting on the familiar carpet where they had played countless games with their father. The room still held traces of his presence, a book he had been reading to them left open on the side table, his coffee cup from that morning still sitting on the windowsill, the indent in his favorite chair where he sat for bedtime stories. She tried to find words that would comfort them without lying, that would explain his absence without revealing the fear that lived in her own heart. Royal children learned early about duty and service, about the weight of responsibility that came with their birthright. But they were still so young, still deserved the innocence of believing their father would always come home safe. The afternoon brought well-meaning visitors, family members who offered support wrapped in careful conversations, staff who tried to maintain normal routines despite the obvious change in the household's rhythm. Catherine accepted their sympathy with grace, played her role as the composed royal wife who trusted in duty and honor. But beneath the surface, she struggled with an anxiety that no amount of training had prepared her for. Evening fell like a curtain over the first day of their separation. The children's bedtime routine felt hollow without William's voice joining in the familiar songs, without his presence to help settle small disputes or provide extra hugs when needed. Catherine read the stories alone, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through, determined to maintain their sense of security even when her own felt shattered. After the children were finally asleep, Catherine found herself wandering the private quarters she and William shared. His clothes still hung in the wardrobe, his books sat in neat stacks beside their bed, his favorite tea waited in the kitchen cupboard. Everything remained exactly as he had left it, creating the illusion that he might walk through the door at any moment, that this separation was just a bad dream from which she could wake. The secure phone they had given her remained silent on the bedside table, its presence both comforting and taunting. She had been told that communication would be limited and unpredictable, that weeks might pass without any word from him. The not knowing was almost worse than the separation itself. Not knowing where he was, what dangers he faced, whether he was thinking of home with the same desperate longing that filled her every waking moment. Night deepened around the palace, and Catherine prepared for her first sleep alone in their bed. The space felt enormous without William beside her, cold despite the warmth of the covers they had shared for so many years. She lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the palace settling for the night, and realized that this was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring another day of waiting, another day of carrying on without him, another day of hoping for his safe return. The moonlight streaming through their windows illuminated the empty pillow where his head should have been, and Catherine finally allowed herself to cry. Quiet tears for all the goodbyes that had to be wordless, for all the days that stretched ahead without knowing when or if he would return, for all the love that would have to sustain them both across whatever distance now separated them. Days turned into weeks with agonizing slowness, each sunrise bringing hope for news that rarely came. Catherine learned to live with the constant ache in her chest, the feeling that part of her heart was walking around somewhere in the world beyond her reach. She developed new routines to fill the spaces where William used to be, but every adaptation felt like accepting that his absence might become permanent. The children adjusted with the resilience that only the young possess, though Catherine caught them in quiet moments staring out windows or asking questions about when their father would return. George had taken on a protective role with his younger siblings, sensing his mother's carefully hidden sadness and trying to be the man of the house in ways that broke her heart. Charlotte drew pictures of their family with increasingly elaborate details, as if she could draw her father back home through sheer artistic will. Palace life continued around them with professional sympathy. Staff members went about their duties with extra gentleness, understanding that routine was both necessary and painful. Official functions still required Catherine's presence, and she attended them with the same grace she had always shown, though everything felt like acting now, like playing a role in someone else's life. The secure phone finally rang on a Tuesday evening, while Catherine was reading bedtime stories. The sound made her heart leap so violently she nearly dropped the book, and she quickly settled the children with their nanny before rushing to answer. William's voice came through crackling with static, distant and distorted but unmistakably his. They had only minutes to talk and every word had to count. He couldn't tell her where he was or what he was doing, but he could tell her that he was safe, that he thought of her and the children every moment, that he carried their love with him like armor against whatever dangers he faced. Catherine tried to pack all her own love into her voice, tried to let him hear that they were managing, that home was waiting for him, that nothing had changed in her heart despite the distance between them. The call ended too quickly, leaving Catherine with more questions than answers, but also with a precious gift: the sound of his voice, the knowledge that he was alive and thinking of them. She held on to that conversation like a lifeline, replaying every word, every inflection, every pause that might have hidden meanings she needed to understand. More weeks passed with no further contact. Catherine threw herself into her royal duties with renewed dedication, channeling her worry into charity work and public appearances that gave her purpose beyond waiting. She visited hospitals where other families faced their own separations and uncertainties, finding strength in their stories of resilience and hope. Each person she met reminded her that love could survive distance, that families could endure whatever tests came their way. The children's questions became more pointed as time went on. George wanted to know why other fathers came home from work every day, but theirs didn't. Charlotte asked if drawing enough pictures of their family would make their father appear. Louis began looking for William in every room they entered, his small face confused when each search ended in disappointment. Catherine answered each question with patience, but internally she struggled with her own doubts and fears. Late at night, when the palace was quiet and the children were asleep, Catherine found herself standing in William's study, surrounded by his books and papers and personal belongings. She could almost feel his presence in that room, could almost hear his voice discussing his day or sharing his thoughts about their children's futures. These moments sustained her but also tormented her, making his absence feel both temporary and eternal. The second phone call came in the middle of the night, waking Catherine from restless sleep. This time William's voice sounded different, tired, strained, more distant than before. He couldn't talk long, and she sensed there were things he wanted to say but couldn't, words that security protocols wouldn't allow. Their conversation felt like trying to touch hands through thick glass. Close but separated by barriers neither could cross. As autumn approached, Catherine realized she had learned to live in a state of suspended time, where each day was measured not by what happened but by what didn't happen. No news, no calls, no sign that William's mission was nearing its end. She had become an expert at hope deferred, at love maintained across silence, at raising their children while carrying the weight of uncertainty about their father's fate. The palace gardens where she and William had walked together began to change with the season, leaves falling like the days that passed without him. Catherine gathered some of these leaves with the children, pressing them between the pages of books so they could show their father how autumn had looked when he returned. The word "when" had become an act of faith, a refusal to consider any alternative future that didn't include his safe homecoming. The first snow of winter was falling when Catherine received the call that would change everything. She was in the nursery with the children, helping them build a fort out of cushions and blankets when her private secretary appeared in the doorway, with the expression that made her blood run cold. The message was brief but carried the weight of months of waiting. William's mission was complete, and he was coming home. The news spread through the palace like wildfire, though it remained carefully contained within their trusted inner circle. Staff members who had watched Catherine carry the burden of separation with quiet dignity allowed themselves small smiles as they went about their duties. The household that had learned to function around an absence began preparing for a presence that would make everything whole again. Catherine felt a mixture of joy and terror that surprised her with its intensity. After months of managing without him, the prospect of his return required emotional adjustments she hadn't anticipated. Would they fit back together as seamlessly as they had separated? Would the children remember how to be with their father? Would the man who returned be the same one who had left? Or would his experiences have changed him in ways she couldn't understand? The children sensed the change in atmosphere immediately, picking up on their mother's nervous energy and the unusual excitement among the staff. George asked direct questions about whether his father was finally coming home, while Charlotte began drawing pictures of reunions with an intensity that spoke of long-held hopes finally being acknowledged. Louis, now several months older than when William left, showed no recognition of his father's name, a painful reminder of how much time had passed. Days passed in careful preparation, though Catherine had learned not to count on anything until William actually walked through their door. Palace security made discreet arrangements while medical staff stood by, understanding that royal operatives sometimes returned from missions needing care that couldn't be provided in ordinary circumstances. Every detail was planned except the most important one: what they would say to each other when they finally stood face to face again. The call came on a cold Thursday morning, just as Catherine was having breakfast with the children. William's plane had landed and he was being transported to the palace through secure channels that would keep his return private until the family had time to reunite. Catherine felt her hands begin to shake as she tried to maintain normal conversation with the children while inside her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. She positioned herself and the children in the same sitting room where they had said goodbye months earlier, hoping that the familiar surroundings would help bridge the gap between their memories of him and the reality of his return. Charlotte clutched the collection of drawings she had made during his absence, while George stood near the window watching for any sign of approaching cars. Louis played contentedly with his toys, unaware that his world was about to expand in ways he couldn't remember or understand. The sound of car doors closing in the courtyard made Catherine's breath catch in her throat. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside their room, each one bringing them closer to the moment they had dreamed about through all the lonely nights and quiet days. The children fell silent, sensing that something momentous was about to happen, their young faces reflecting the same mixture of anticipation and uncertainty that Catherine felt. The door opened quietly, and William appeared in the entrance like a figure stepping out of their collective memory into reality. He looked thinner than when he had left, his eyes holding experiences he couldn't share, but his smile was the same one that had said goodbye to them so many months ago. For a heartbeat, no one moved, as if they all needed a moment to confirm that this reunion was real and not another dream. Then Charlotte broke the spell by running to him with her drawings clutched in her small hands. and William dropped to his knees to catch her in his arms. George followed more cautiously, his growing maturity making him aware of the magnitude of this moment, while Catherine lifted Louis and brought him closer to the father he had almost forgotten. The family came together in the center of the room, arms wrapping around each other, voices mixing in laughter and tears and words of love that had been saved up through all their time apart. William looked at Catherine over their children's heads, and in his eyes she saw everything she needed to know. He was home, he was safe, and whatever had happened during those months of separation, their love had survived intact. The wordless goodbye that had broken hearts around the world was finally answered by a reunion that spoke of love's ability to endure any test, to bridge any distance, to heal any wound that duty might inflict. They were whole again, and the waiting was finally over.